Right, excuse me, chapter 13. The title of the chapter is How Populations Evolve. So the next couple chapters deal with the topic of evolution, which is a very polar subject. What I'm going to do is present you information, how you decide to how much of that information you take into account. You think you want to keep as knowledge that you think is what you want to believe. I'm just providing information, all right? I'm not trying to sway you one way or another. The first part of the chapter, though, deals with population genetics and deals with natural selection. And that part, you can sort of see how that works within populations, all right? So we're not going to talk about human evolution or anything like that. And macroevolution just in a little bit toward the end of chapter 15. But so most of the chapter is going to deal with, this chapter is going to deal with microevolution, right? Small scale. A little bit about Charles Darwin. He's known as the father of evolution, and he was a theological student in the Episcopal Church in England, and he was a theology. He was going to be a priest in the Anglican Church. In the 1831, there was a ship that was going around the world, and they needed a naturalist. It was Her Majesty's ship Beagle, and they were going to spend most of their time around the coast of South America, but they were going to actually go on across the earth as they to finish up. But they needed a naturalist. One of the seminary professors, noticed how meticulous Darwin was in note-taking and documenting things. And he thought that would be a really good trait for him to have as a member of this naturalist team on this ship. And so he was recommended. His friend, the professor's friend, was the captain on the ship. He nominated or asked his captain if Darwin would be the person. He thinks Darwin would be the person that would be right for the job. So Darwin took the job, and so he set out on this 5-year world global trip. Textbooks are just not all over the place like they are now, and so he did have a geology text with him, and he read that cover to cover and realized there was a theory in there called the theory of uniformity. This was by Lyell, who was a British geologist. And the theory stated that the same geographic processes that are now sculpting the Earth, like volcanism, seismology, erosion, all those kind of things that build and break down the Earth, were also working in the past. So with that information, they started going around their trip, and he would go in from the ship on a rowboat. They would row in. He would go on the mainland, collect organisms, send them back to the ship. Those organisms then would be later taken to people who were identifying organisms and classifying them. We'll talk about that a little later in Europe. And so this trip was going to provide a lot of information about species that hadn't been seen before by Europeans, right? And so They went around the coast of South America, and they were on their way back north in the Pacific. And there are a group of islands that they had been told about that were off the coast of Ecuador that had these large tortoises. These tortoises were a good source of meat, because meat is something that can rot and doesn't stay well preserved for long periods of time. And so they had planned to stop at these little islands called the Galapagos and stay there and get some meat, so that later on that they would have this for the rest of their trip. And so on that island there were finches. Finches are a little bird, and the Galapagos are kind of unique in the fact that there are many ecosystems in a short distance from each other. So you have the rocky coastline, and that transitions into a grassland. All right, I'm sorry. It transitions into a rainforest. All right, and then as you go higher in altitude, that rainforest transitions into grassland. And as you go further up the mountain, it goes into tundra. And then at the top, it's tundra and ice and stuff like that. So, and it's more bare. So as they were stopped there to replenish meat, etc., Darwin made all these observations. One of those on the finch. So the finches were all over the island, but the ones that were in the rainforest had a real thick beak, and then the ones up in the grasslands had a real thin beak. They looked the same, but they just had these different beaks. And he noticed that the thick beak finches were really able to eat fruit. They could tear through the fruit really easily, but they weren't very good at like little grass seeds. Whereas the thin-billed finches could were really nimble and could eat the grass seeds really well, but they couldn't really do much with fruit. They couldn't tear through the fruit as well. So they were they were very similar, but they had these two different phenotypes that sort of made them more able to cope with the type of environment they were living in. Similarly, there were these iguanas. There were some iguanas that lived on the coast, on the rocky shore, and then some that lived up in the rainforest. The ones in the rainforest were those green iguanas that he saw all along the South American coast when he would visit. They had a tail that was prehensile, allowed them to hold on to tree limbs. They had separate fingers that allowed them to grasp onto tree limbs. And they were green, which was the color of the vegetation around them. And they lived in trees. Along the rocky coast, there were some iguanas that looked very similar, except they had a dark coloration, a dark gray, instead of green. And their tails were flat instead of rounded, and it allowed them to swim in the rough surf. And they also had webbing between their toes that allowed them to swim better in that rough surf. They eat algae on the bottom of the ocean, and so all of that would allow them to feed better in their habitat that they were using. Right? So from all these observations, he came up with a theory of natural selection. Any population can change over time when individuals of the population differ in one or more heritable traits, that are responsible for differences in the ability to survive and reproduce with changes in environment. Sometimes it's called the survival of the fittest. We'll talk a little bit more how that works here in a second. And it culminated in him producing The Origin of Species and Origin of the Species in 1859. So he did not, he was sort of endorsed by the seminary to go on this trip. He put together his book. There was another scientist who was coming up with similar ideas, and there was some sort of pressure on him by the press to go ahead and publish his paper, all right, his book. When it came out, he did not think that he was he thought he was going to be highly praised for his work, and what happened was the church excommunicated him. He then became bitter and started sort of fighting back at the church with ideas and theory, all right? And so just want to give you a little bit of background information because he's sort of demonized in some respect and held to high standards in some respects, and just giving you some information to let you decide what you want to think about Darwin. All right. So there are some ologies, some sciences, branches of sciences that are used to help support the idea of evolution. One's paleontology. That's the study of fossils. Fossils are hard remains of organisms that lived a long time ago, and certain layers have certain types of fossils, and that those layers can be used to identify similar time frames in certain continent and different continents and that kind of thing. That's how they use paleontology. How paleontology is used. Biogeography is a cool study. This is the study of world distribution of plants and animals. So the plantain tree in England is, if you go out to the river or creek, there are these big trees called sycamores, right? The sycamore and the plantain tree are very closely related. They look very similar as far as their bark and their leaves. If you held two leaves from each species together, you would not be able to tell which one's which. But they live on different continents, and if you try to take the seed and germinate it, pollinate it with if you take a ovary from a sycamore and try to pollinate it with the plantain tree, you would get fertilization, right? Because they're two different species. Right? So that's the study of biogeography. Comparative anatomy is the study of differences and similarities in body plans of different organisms. How they look. What's different, what's similar, all right? Lungfish, all species of lungfish look very, very similar. But there's one species that lives in Southeast Asia, one lives in Africa, one lives in South America, but they're different. They look very similar. They have the similar body plans. This leads us into homologous structures. Remember, homologous chromosomes are those chromosomes that have the same genes, length, and shape. Well, homologous structures are those structures that come from the same region of the body have the same ancestry and are arranged similarly, but they may not have the same function. If you look at the bone structure of an arm of a human, a bat wing, and a fluke or fin of a whale, you can see the same bone structure in each of those organisms. But we don't use our arm the way a bat uses its wing, and the bat doesn't use the wing like the whale uses its fin or fluke. All right. Analogous structures would be like a butterfly, a bat, and a bird. All right. All use that structure the same for the similar function, which is flight, but their tissues are different, and so they're not very similar. They don't have the same ancestry, that kind of thing. So they're not, they're analogous, all right? But homologous structures don't have to have the same function, but they are different. They are similar in that they're the same body region, same ancestral makeup, and same tissue arrangement, all right? Number 4 is comparative embryology. This is a study of structures that develop or appear during development in different organisms. We'll find out that all chordates, which are vertebrates, all right, for the most part, they have 4 things in common. They all have a dorsal nerve cord. We have a spinal cord. They all have a nodal cord in development. This nodal cord most of the time will then develop into either cartilage or bone backbone. All right, so we have the spinal cord with our backbone, all right, our vertebral column. And then all of them will have pharyngeal gill slits. If you look at a human fetus early in life, it has gill. Pharyngeal means throat, so on the throat there are gills. Gill slits, openings. We don't have to breathe oxygen from water, so they form over, and you don't see them again as development occurs. And all have a tail. But that tail we don't have to have, so it is absorbed, and those cells used for other things. All right, so that's comparative embryology. Molecular biology is more of the big picture, with the study of the molecular basis of genes. All genes made up the same bases we just talked about. There are only 4 bases, and all of them are, and those 4 bases are in the DNA of all species and that kind of thing. So that's molecular biology. All right, so we just want to emphasize that the lowest level of organization, and that level of organization of life that we talked about in chapter 1, very first thing we talked about, the lowest level where evolution takes place is the population. It's not the individual. Individuals don't evolve. Populations do. All right, and this is where the natural selection and things take place, and so just to refresh you, population is a group of individuals of the same species occupying a given area. Right? All individuals of a population have 3 traits that are similar, morphological traits. They look similarly, how they look, how their body parts are put together. Even though a Irish Wolfhound and a Chihuahua have differences in size, their bodies are put together fairly similarly, and so their morphological traits are similar. Right? Physiological traits are how the body parts work. All right, they work similarly. So dogs whether it be the Irish Wolfhound or the Chihuahua, they feed and eat the same, and their digestive tract is similar, so it digests the food similarly, all right? Physiological traits. Behavioral traits all respond to stimuli in the same way. So a dog, you can teach a dog to sit, whether it be an Irish Wolfhound or a Chihuahua, all right? So they have all these traits in common, right? And so this brings us into the definition of what a species is, all right? The definition of a biological species is a population or a group of populations whose individuals have the same potential to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That's the linchpin right there. They have to be able to produce fertile offspring. Those offspring have to be able to have offspring that are fertile, that can have offspring of their own. So if you take a Chihuahua and an Irish Wolfhound and you mate them, you will get puppies, all right? Now, you want to make sure that the female is the Irish Wolfhound and the male is the Chihuahua, because the puppies could be larger than what the Chihuahua could handle if it was the other way around. But the point is, those puppies then, when they grow up, they can make other puppies, right? So they're not sterile, they're fertile, so by definition, they're still the same species, all right? Even though they look different as far as size goes, all right? So this level of, the lowest level of evolution is called, at the population level, is called microevolution, right? And it really occurs in what is called the gene pool of the population. The gene pool is the total collection of genes in a population at any given time. It contains all individuals making up of the population, and so all those individuals, most of the time there are two alleles, right? We talked about alleles for a specific gene in the gene pool, all right? And the dominant allele would be more populous, you know, in the gene pool than the recessive allele, right? And so this is the percentage of the dominant allele and the recessive allele of a particular gene in the gene pool is called the relative frequency of those alleles. All right? If nothing happens to the gene pool, if there are no actions, no events that would influence the gene pool at a given time, then there would be status quo, right? You wouldn't have any changes in that gene pool. However, that really doesn't happen in nature, right? Because there's all sorts of different things influencing, putting pressure on the allele frequencies of certain genes in the gene pool, right? And there are 5 that are major players, okay? These 5 are genetic drift, gene flow, mutation, non-random mating, and natural selection. So the last part of the chapter, we're going to deal with these 5 forces on the gene pool.